Good morning. We are, many have said, and I agree, at a kairos moment. This is a term that comes from a Greek notion of time. It conveys a spiritual imperative, and it's been invoked quite often at special times in history. And it implies urgency, grace, and opportunity. The reason people refer to a kairos moment now is both the critical nature of the problems that are facing the world, but also the very rare opportunity of so many groups of leaders coming together with a different focus. The Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations General Assembly, the upcoming Paris COP21, the G8 meeting, G20 meeting, here in Turkey, countless meetings happening on refugee issues, negotiations on the many conflicts, obviously Syria, Iraq, but also Burundi, South Sudan, Philippines, Colombia, secret meetings, public meetings that are happening all over the world. There's another meeting happening right now in Finland that I'm also supposed to be at, which is of religious and traditional peacemakers. So it really is an extraordinary moment, and it's one where I think part of the challenge is to understand how all of these issues are coming together, and the challenge for us to understand the ways in which they're coming together, to disentangle the threads, to establish the links, and to appreciate their significance in terms of what we can and what we should do. The challenge that's presented here of sustainable development, at its core, sustainable, linked with development, means first the idea that development has moved from what it largely was understood to be, and we're going back now to the 1950s and 60s, as a relatively simple concept of progress, largely grounded in economics, almost with a mathematical tone to it, even though it was then underlaid with a dual sense of social justice and a sense of that a common good would in fact serve the interests of all. Today, I think the concept of development and the concept of sustainable development is really quite different, and it describes a highly complex and interrelated set of challenges that are embedded in the phenomenon of globalization, in notions of global governance and responsibility, of interstate relations, of social justice, and I think relevant particularly here, of human rights. So the central question for us here today is how religious factors fit into this concept of sustainable development. There are several disciplines, professions, academic traditions, and worldviews that are involved. So my focus today is on how these are linked. And simplistically, these fields are economic and social development, peace building, environment, and religious studies and approaches. So I'm going to start by telling two quick stories that have the form of parables. The first one took place when I was a country director for a desert country in Africa some years ago, at a time when human rights were central to concerns about that country. There were very uncomfortable issues related to extrajudicial killings, to refugee movements, land grabs, a whole host of issues that are sadly rather familiar. And I was traveling to an area where these issues were vivid with the Minister of Agriculture, who did not want to be with that American woman. So I was trying to find ways of conversation. And I started by asking him about camels. And being someone from the desert, he knew every camel in the country's name. And we had a wonderful conversation about trade and about milk and meat and so forth. And then I went on to cattle. He knew something about cattle, but wasn't as interested. Sheep and goats, not very interested. Poultry, not interested at all. Crops, not much spark. And then we came to a village, and I looked around and saw what you see in African villages, which is donkeys carrying children, carrying materials for roofing, water, you name it. And so I said to him, well, what about donkeys? He said, we don't have any donkeys. So I looked around me and I said, well, what are these? And he said, not important. So this is a parable basically for the ways in which many development actors have in fact viewed and seen the religious elements. In other words, something that's in front of your face, that's obviously significant, and yet something to which people are blind. So I think that's our starting point, that the topic of religion in development circles was often completely ignored, and people were often quite blind to it. Another quick parable, this is the priest and the education specialist. So I was visiting, working on issues of education at that time in the context of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100. And we wanted to focus on sharpening our understanding of the religious dimensions of education. So I took a priest who was working with me to visit someone who had just completed a major study of education in the greater Middle East. So the priest immediately launched into a discussion about Al-Azhar and theological exchange programs. And I watched my colleague, the education specialist, begin to pull out his BlackBerry, and his eyes went completely blank. You know, what is Al-Azhar? What does theological education have to do with me? So I changed the subject and asked him, well, what role did he specifically have in discussions of curriculum and of teaching about religion? And he looked up immediately and said, no, our goal is values-free education, at which the priest completely blanched. So once again, this is an illustration of, first of all, two very sensible people with sensible agendas. The point of the education specialist was education without ideology, not education necessarily devoid of values. But what he did was he fed immediately into the priest's preconception that secular education has no values, and the priest's assumption that the critical issue was theological education fed immediately into the specialist's view that he was out somewhere in outer space without any grip on the real issues and the real challenges. So those are two quick stories to illustrate, I think, where some of the challenges are where we start. So I'm starting with a focus on four perspectives on the world, four worldviews, as I said, four disciplines, places where students study, professions, etc. The religious institutions and beliefs, which I will return to, international development thinking, peace building, and climate change and development. Each one of these, I would add, faces major governance challenges. Challenges at the global level, as well as challenges at a much more micro, national, subnational, and institutional level that I think you could even call a crisis that faces each of these separate areas. So the challenge is both to understand and disentangle and to link them. So first of all, international development. It's my view that there's a lot of stuck thinking in what is a very dynamic field. It's useful to remember that immediately after World War II, there were in fact two groups of countries, rich and poor, and that is simply no longer true. So to talk about developing countries is almost as much of a nonsense as it is to talk about the third world. And it's useful to remember that most students today have no idea what the second world is, because it's one that they have never lived. Quite some years ago, private sector flows bypassed or passed ODA, Official Development Assistance, and it's now substantially greater. You have an enormous number of actors, an enormous number of ideas, widely divergent views, sometimes jarring, but it is a very complex, multifaceted field that, as I said before, faces something of a governance crisis. Before I go any further with this, I do want to underscore my personal belief, which is that there is an imperative for international development. And if I have to give a priority, I give it to that. As it's been said many times, including by Harry Truman in his inaugural address in 1949, that this is the first time in human history that we genuinely have the possibility to offer to every human being a decent life. That means education, health, the opportunity for a job. And we have made enormous progress, and that is something that people often lose sight of. But there are very wide gulfs. These SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal framework that Cole Durham highlighted in his introduction, is an important milestone. With the 17 goals, 169 targets, indicators being developed, it basically represents an effort to look at this goal of offering everyone a decent life from an international perspective, to introduce some of the disciplines of the private sector, which means deadlines, accountability, responsibility, etc. But there are, I think, 4 important trends and areas of focus that are particularly relevant for the discussions here in Istanbul today. The first is the rising concern with fragile states. In other words, there are a group of countries, somewhere between 33 and 50, depending on how you count them, that have basically been left behind in the extraordinary progress. And there is a recognition that there need to be new approaches to these countries. Not quite clear what they are, because in many ways, as Tolstoy said, happy families are all fairly similar. Successful countries have some similarities, but unsuccessful countries are each unsuccessful or challenged in their own way. But the fact that we need new approaches to this particular group of fragile states is critically important. Secondly, there are huge challenges around the issues of equity. The inequality, the glaring inequalities in the world, which are the subject of so many poignant images. 80 people in a bus with half the world's income, these extraordinary, outrageous figures surrounding inequality. But to be very honest, very little agreement, very little consensus on what to do about it. The third issue that is a concern to me is that there is not very much thoughtful discussion about the different models of development. There is a general, almost end of history sense that the market model is what's here. And yet, particularly, I must say, in religious circles, but also in something like Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical, you hear very strong doubts about the validity of the market model, but very little real discussion about it. And then the fourth issue, which I think also focuses particularly on this conference, is that there are new questions and doubts about human rights, all the way from the most basic human right, which I would say is equality between men and women, to a number of other issues and questions about how human rights, including religious freedom, relates to the challenges of economic and social development. So the links to religious dimensions were initially almost invisible and very patchy. A lot of concern about instrumentalization. Are we simply trying to use religion to promote hand washing or whatever other noble goal there is in the development world? And I, in 35 years in the World Bank and many other years discussing country strategies, cannot recall a single discussion where there was an explicit question about the meaning of religious freedom. Indirect ones, but not direct. It was simply not part of the agenda. So let me turn to the second of these major fields, which is peace building. I left the World Bank 10 years ago to work at Georgetown University and to head this NGO. And I have to admit that I had rarely come across peace building or conflict resolution as a single field. Am I through?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the meaning of it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see that before. Okay, so let me quickly go through. So peace building. So the point is that peace building involves DDR, disarmament, demobilization, integration. The fact that conflicts recur is a serious issue. Need for reconciliation, many roles of religion. But peace building and development and currently environmental issues have been very little linked. And so there are many needs to bring the peace building field together. And then finally, a whole new set of challenges that are emerging around climate change and environment. Where there, for example, are very different views of growth, of life, and social justice. And even when people in these fields profoundly agree, there's very often a complete disconnect in the way in which they're approaching problems and in their dialogue with one another. So I'm going simply to list, because time got completely away with me, some challenges that I think we face and that I'm hoping that we will be looking to in the course of this conference. First of all, there's a major need for engagement and knowledge among these different fields, particularly the religious and the secular, but also the development, peace building, and climate change. We need to have much better understanding of each other. We need to make much more explicit efforts to enhance religious sensitivity, expertise, literacy among all of these fields, and we have to define what that means. Third, partnerships are a critical issue. We need sensible reflections on how to achieve them, what are the key steps and pitfalls to avoid. We need to address the issue of proselytism, which is a major issue in many parts of the world, with good codes of conduct and with practical approaches to the way proselytism is linked to development work, where there are issues of power and imbalances of power. We need to understand better the special roles of religious tensions and thus religious freedom in fragile states, the issue I mentioned. We need to understand better the links between social cohesion and the lively religious marketplaces that are taking place. We need to focus on issues in the context of the current humanitarian crises, humanitarian principles and covenants. Where is this appropriate? Where is it not? What are the humanitarian principles? I think we can focus on some specific issues, just as examples of areas where there's common ground but also need for complementarity: orphan care, family planning, child marriage, domestic violence, water issues, conflict resolution, corruption, extractive industries. So my hope is that we could emerge from this summit with a solid list of issues to focus on. I think we can also have concerted efforts to focus on some vital common goals, where again, corruption, maternal and child mortality, and quality education are good examples. And finally, I think we need better handles on the field of interfaith engagement. It's a very diverse world. The left and the right hands don't know what each other is doing. They're unaware. Evaluation is a challenge and is particularly weak, and yet it offers enormous potential for the future. Thank you.